Thanks very much. Let's get in then to our session, which is the government leadership session. Before I call the panel up, we're going to hear first from the Climate Change Minister, the Honourable James Shaw. Please welcome him.
O tēnā koe, Catherine. Tēnā koutou, i tēnei ata. Good morning. Hello. It's been a while. It's lovely to see you all. Recently, you might have noticed that I had cause in the media to say that I consider that my job is only half done. So I wanted to take the opportunity of this year's Climate and Business Conference to give you a midpoint review, a halfway report card. A look at the past, a look at the present, and a look at the future of climate change policy here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I want to start with a visitation from the ghost of climate policy past. Our main area of focus in our first term of government, when I say the recent past, not the ancient past, when David Parker was in charge, our main areas of focus in our first term and in the first half of the second term has been on governance and accountability, on emissions pricing, on the greening of the finance sector, on transport and energy emissions. And when it comes to governance and accountability, much of this you already know. We obviously focused in our first term on establishing the institutional framework to guide climate policy and action in Aotearoa over the coming decades. That, of course, was the Zero Carbon Act, and through that we became one of the first countries in the world to put the 1.5 degree global warming threshold into primary legislation. Having said that, based on some recent court cases, it looks like we might need to strengthen that somewhat. We declared a climate emergency and we committed the public service to carbon neutrality, which is 25 years in advance of what we're asking of the rest of the country. We established the Climate Change Commission, and we now, of course, have our first 3 emissions budgets to 2025, 2030 and 2035, more stringent than the Commission itself proposed. And we've recently published the country's first ever all-of-government emissions reduction plan and national adaptation plan. 15 ministers with over 18 portfolios between them, that's 3/5 of the executive, as well as over 20 government ministries, departments and agencies have got specific named responsibilities in those plans. So the big shift recently, in fact this year, as a result of all of this work, climate change has gone from being the problem of the Minister of Climate Change and the Ministry for the Environment to everybody's problem, right across government. Emissions pricing has been the centrepiece of climate policy in this country since 2008. When David Parker was in charge. For most of this time, it was an abject failure after he was in charge, because the previous government spiked it to ensure that polluters paid almost no price at all. So we had a cap and trade system without a cap, and polluters had unlimited access to international units at rock bottom prices. So for almost the entire time that we've had an emissions trading scheme, our emissions went up rather than down, which is the precise opposite outcome that you would want from a policy in which emissions are supposed to go down rather than up. In 2014, which was the year I was elected to Parliament, the average price of carbon was $3.87 a tonne. I know, right? In 2017, when I was elected into government, it had recovered to $18 a tonne. In 2020, we overhauled the emissions trading scheme and we put a sinking lid on emissions for the first time. And as a result of those changes that we've made, the price of pollution has increased 5-fold from $18 a tonne in 2017 to $85 a tonne today. And you remember the hot air scandal? We talked a lot about that at previous conferences. Most of those international units were so cheap because they weren't worth the paper that they were written on. And I've written off every single one of those dodgy units. There isn't a single one of those left in our system here in Aotearoa. Now, asked why he robbed banks, John Dillinger apparently said that that's where the money is. Now, the financial services sector itself is not a major contributor to emissions. And if you ask the average person where we need to focus in order to bring down emissions, most people would say agriculture or transport or energy, and of course they would be right. Except, of course, that all of that work requires financing. So the role and the influence of the finance sector in the transition, I think, is underestimated. And it has been a big focus of our work in the recent past. So we established Green Investment Finance and capitalised that with an initial $400 million to galvanise private sector finance into the green economy. And it's already had some wins. And just the other day, you might have seen in the paper that Solar Zero, one of the companies that Green Investment Finance has been working with, has been bought by BlackRock. And over the coming 7 to 10 years, BlackRock are going to put $1 billion above the sale price into Solar Zero. Now, that's a lot of solar panels. It's $1 billion worth of solar panels in this country as a result of that. We barred default KiwiSaver funds from investing in fossil fuels, and given that something like 75% of all New Zealanders stick with their default funds, that represents a pretty significant divestment. We put in place a responsible investment framework for the government's funds, NZ Super, ACC and the Government Superannuation Fund. They all now have net zero strategies. So I do want to acknowledge that NZ Super has been leading the way and is one of the world's leading funds in that area. And just this last week, of course, NZ Super announced that they were shifting 40% of their entire portfolio into low carbon funds. Also last week, Grant and I announced the government's framework for the upcoming sovereign green bond issue. Now, that doesn't amount to any new debt, but it does mean that the debt that we take on will come with strings attached. And that means that there's an extra layer of accountability that's taking us towards net zero. And as I know you all well know, we are the first country in the world to require all large listed companies and large financial institutions to report on their climate-related risks from next year. And that, I am told, is already having an impact even before the first reports are due. So for example, I was talking to a bank the other day that started talking to its farming customers about how to lower their climate-related risks. And that means obviously building resilience to the increasingly frequent and severe storms and floods and droughts, but it also means reducing the emissions from farms that cause climate change in the first place. So I know it's not the most visible area of climate policy and action, but I am very proud of the work that we've done on greening the financial sector, because shifting those capital flows will make a colossal difference in the years to come. Now, having said that, we have also put a lot of effort into the two main sources of carbon dioxide emissions, energy and transport. We've invested billions of dollars into buses and trains, cycling and walking infrastructure. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Tauranga visiting the company that are very busy manufacturing Wellington City's fleet of fully battery electric double-decker buses. So they're not imported, they're actually being made right here in Aotearoa. And also being built here are the new electric ferries that are going to be going across Wellington and Auckland harbours, which is awesome. We brought in vehicle emission standards for new imports for the first time in New Zealand history. And we brought back the mandate to include biofuels in the petrol that we'll still be using in our old internal combustion engine vehicles for years to come. We've invested in the EV charging infrastructure around the country, and we've started to replace the entire government fleet with zero-emission vehicles. We've also, by the way, shrunk the size of that fleet by about a quarter, because it turns out when you start asking questions, you can actually do with fewer of them in the first place. Some people refer to that as degrowth. And the clean car discount has outperformed even our most optimistic scenarios. 1 in 5 new cars sold in this country is now a battery electric vehicle. That's 20%. And it's actually over 40% if you include hybrids. Now, I remember a day not so long ago when we were applauding Norway for getting to the point where 1 in 5 new cars sold in Norway was an electric vehicle. We were so impressed with that. Now it's 80% in Norway, and it'll be 80% in the not too distant future here as well, I believe. When it comes to energy and industrial heat, one of the first acts, of course, that we did was to end new offshore oil and gas exploration, and alongside that we set up Araaki, the New Energy Research Centre in Taranaki, to kickstart energy innovation in this country. We started replacing our own coal boilers in our schools, our hospitals, our universities with renewable alternatives. And one of our most successful programs, the Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry Fund, is helping businesses to switch to renewables. Now, the projects that the GIDI Fund has already invested in will cut emissions by 7.5 million tonnes over the coming years. And that's before we put in this year's budget allocation of an additional $650 million. So you can imagine what that is going to be able to do in terms of reducing our energy and industrial heat. So like I said, most of the effort over the last few years has been on energy and transport, but there are a couple of mentions in other sectors that I wanted to draw attention to, I think, because they haven't had as much attention as they deserve. So, for example, in the Building and Construction Centre, we made Green Star 6 the minimum build standard for all new state homes. Now, that's awesome. That means annual energy savings of around $570 per household in some of the households that are least able to afford energy. It also means an 80% decrease in construction waste from every single building site. We also, of course, increased subsidies for home insulation and extended that to thousands more homes as well. One of the most effective programs that we've ever had. When it comes to forestry, we set up the Billion Trees program and invested $1.2 billion in Jobs for Nature, which is now creating permanent carbon sinks all over New Zealand, as well as thousands of jobs, many of which are in areas of long-term deprivation and persistent unemployment. And it hasn't all been about mitigation, of course. We conducted the first nationwide climate change risk assessment and committed millions of dollars to flood defences in some of our most vulnerable communities. And on the international front, we quadrupled our climate change-related aid from $300 million to $1.3 billion. And at least half of that will go to the Pacific, and at least half of that will go on adaptation and resilience. So, this is why I say repeatedly that we have done more in the last 5 years to fight the climate crisis than the combined efforts of governments over the course of the last 30 years. Is it enough? No. Not even close. It never will be. There will always be more to do. We are yet to see a sustained decline in our greenhouse gas emissions, and even when we do, we need to ensure that that decline continues and in fact picks up pace every year until we hit net zero. But it's also not nothing. It is a marathon effort involving every part of government, every sector of the economy, and every member of our team of 5 million over the course of the next 3 decades and beyond. Which brings me to the ghost of climate policy present. So right now, we are setting up the Interdepartmental Executive Board that will oversee the implementation of the several hundred actions that are outlined in the Emissions Reduction Plan and the National Adaptation Plan over the coming years. And I do want to acknowledge Lisa Daniel in the room, who has been appointed the Executive Director of that board. Please form an orderly queue. Where's Lisa? Where are you, Lisa? Now, I know that everybody in this room, starting with me, will have complaints about the silos that make up central government. One of the elements of the Emissions Reduction Plan that I don't think we make enough of is that we're constructing a horizontal coordinating function to sit across all of those vertical silos that make up the government. Each chief executive on that board has individual responsibility for executing their agency's part of the plan, but they also have collective responsibility for the plan as a whole. And that includes advising ministers of any changes that might need to happen to ensure that we meet our emissions budgets. But much of my focus as Minister of Climate Change for the balance of this parliamentary term is primarily dealing with the land sector. There is a ton of things going on which are all related to each other in some way. So we'll be consulting shortly on our response to He Waka Eke Noa, the primary industry partnership on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions pricing. This has to be up and running on 23,000 farms in about 30 months, which in governmental terms might as well be tomorrow. Now, alongside that, the Climate Change Commission is very worried that the current ETS settings will lead to a glut of forestry offsets in the 2030s. And that in turn could crash the ETS price and a return to the bad old days of companies just using cheap offsets rather than actually reducing their emissions. So whilst we put a cap into the ETS, it is a soft cap. And that's because any time anyone plants enough trees to sequester a tonne of carbon, we automatically generate an NZU, which is a permit to pollute a tonne of carbon into the atmosphere, which means technically that unlimited forestry allows for unlimited pollution. Aotearoa is the only country in the world with an ETS that allows companies to offset 100% of their pollution with forestry. In the emissions reduction plan, the government committed to a review of ETS sequestration, supply and demand settings. And so these are the kinds of challenges that review could grapple with. Now, of course, changes in that domain will have significant consequences for the forestry sector. But here's the thing. The government is going to auction off or give away for free something in the order of 90 million tonnes worth of NZUs between now and 2030. Now, none of those 90 million units are backed with forestry offsets. So we're just auctioning and giving away the permit to pollute a tonne of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement calls for us to reduce our net emissions by about 100 million tonnes on top of our domestic emissions budgets. And when we made the decision last year to increase our NDC, Cabinet also prioritised domestic investment and achievement before relying on arrangements with other countries. And I know there's been a bit of chat about that this morning. So that 90 million tonnes that we're going to auction off or give away for free could be backed with domestic forestry. And that would give iwi and other landowners some predictability and reliable income on land that is otherwise incredibly challenging to generate a return from. Now, finally, we are also working on how to restore our native forest and wildlife outside the ETS. The ETS is obviously well set up to sequester carbon dioxide as it should be, but it is not great at achieving biodiversity outcomes. So alongside the implementation of the upcoming National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, Gary, we are also looking at biodiversity credits and incentives. So each one of those projects is an individual piece of the jigsaw puzzle. They are independent in their own right, but they also fit together into the big picture. They don't work on their own. Each piece is interdependent on all of the others in order to make sense in and of itself. It is an astonishingly complex picture. And of course, existing economic interests make tweaking any part of that in isolation exceedingly challenging indeed. Nevertheless, I do have hope that by the time that this parliamentary term draws to a close a year from now, that we will have made significant progress on what the boffins call LULUCF, land use change and forestry, which in plain English is of course just farming, forestry and nature. And other countries are watching very closely on what we do. So the example that we set, which they frequently do ask me about, could set the standard for what other developed countries choose to do with their own farming and forestry and nature-based solutions. Which brings me to the ghost of climate policy to come. So from an almost standing start over the course of the last 5 years, my job has been to get the flywheel of climate policy and action up and whirling to the point where the momentum will continue long after we've gone. Now, the next parliamentary term is when we will see that flywheel do its first full rotation. The year 2025 is the end of the first emissions budget period, and it's the start of the second emissions budget period from 2026 to 2030, which means it's also when we have to publish our second emissions reduction plan for how we'll meet that emissions budget period. It's also when we will decide on the fourth emissions budget period from 2036 to 2040. It's when we will decide our next nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement from 2031 to 2035. It's when we will decide to bring international aviation and shipping activity into our domestic greenhouse gas accounts and targets. And it's when agricultural emissions pricing kicks in on 23,000 farms. Finally, that set of decisions and actions in the next term of Parliament will determine the speed and the momentum of climate policy in Aotearoa for the next 15 years. So we have achieved a heck of a lot over the course of the last 5 years. We are as busy as all get out right now, and we have so much more work that we need to do. And that is why I say that my job is half done, because that flywheel will come full circle for the first time over the course of the next 4 years. And my commitment is to see that through. There are parties in Parliament who, if they get their way, want to dismantle the entire machine that we have built, in which case we will be back where we started 30 years ago. The worst possible scenario that I can imagine for the future of climate policy and action in this country would be for somebody to put the brakes on right now, or worse, for it to come off the axle entirely. I will do whatever I can to make sure that that does not happen. I will do everything in my power to make it go faster. So that energy that we've built up painstakingly over the past 5 years becomes an unstoppable force, driving that transformation over the coming years towards an economy that is productive, that is inclusive, and that is truly sustainable. A smart, green future that works for everyone. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora, Minister, thank you. May I ask our panel just to make your way to the stage? I have just one question for you. I have about 20 actually, but let's just stick to one because I think it's a message to everyone in this room. You've got all the infrastructure there, the legislative infrastructure, you've got the flywheel beginning to turn. The reality is, come 2030, at the rate we are going, this country faces a bill in the multi-billions at even a relatively conservative carbon price under its commitments, under its NDC. Are we on track to meet those commitments? What is the consequence of us missing as much as we are currently on track to miss by?
It's not going to surprise you, there's not a short answer to that question, Catherine. So, no, the answer is we're currently not on track. The thing is, there's a piece of work that Treasury are going to be leading by the end of this year, which is going to quantify what the fiscal liability of that is. So I can't give you that answer right now because that piece of work hasn't been done. But I think a lot, and also we have yet to sign off on the strategy for how we achieve our nationally determined contribution, taking into account Cabinet's direction already that the priority has to be that it's, to the maximum extent possible that it occurs domestically. And to the extent that we cannot do that, then the next priority is to work with countries in the Asia-Pacific region with a focus on helping them to achieve their sustainable development goals. And then the next priority after that is to kind of link with other developed countries like our own in terms of things like ETSs and so on and so forth. So we're yet to kind of sign off on that. And as we do, that will give us a much clearer picture about the liability, whether that's a domestic or an international liability.
Yeah, I think the Ministry of the Environment figures that I saw that may be getting dated now at a carbon price of, say, $70 a tonne is getting up to $8, $9, $10 billion, close to $1 billion a year as we track, and that's not counting the economic multiplier. Cutting gross emissions. Are we over-dependent on the planting and on the offsetting and on paying our way out of this? Yeah. Where is the plan to cut gross emissions?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying before about the forestry offset, that kind of imbalance that the Commission have drawn attention to twice now. That's why we're doing a review of the supply and demand settings in the ETS, because we do have that situation where, like I said, effectively unlimited forestry equals unlimited pollution, at least in theory. Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. Lots of talking, hopefully some action to come. Truly appreciate your time.
With any luck. Thanks.
Truly appreciate your time, Minister. Thank you. Thanks, James. He's right about one thing, and that it is complicated. It is complex. Let's welcome our panel now, and I am truly delighted to welcome you all. Dr. Rod Carr is Chair of the Climate Commission. Morena, welcome, Rod. Welcome also to Vicky Robertson, who is Chief Executive of the Ministry for the Environment and also Secretary for the Environment. Morena, welcome, Vicky. And welcome also to His Worship the Mayor of Auckland, Phil Goff. Lovely to see you. Welcome. Welcome to your own whenua, as only someone with a clipboard from Wellington could say. Can I begin with you, Dr. Carr? Do you want to pick up on what James Shaw was saying there and basically go for it?
Trees. Should we talk trees?
Why not?
Trees and the emissions trading scheme. We live in a mixed economy. Markets have an important part to play in rewarding investors and sending signals to consumers and producers about the real cost and consequences of emissions. We are developing an emissions trading scheme. It is not yet fully mature. There is a lot of work that can be done. Embedded in the emissions trading scheme is an equivalence. It's an equivalence that says 1 tonne of carbon dioxide emitted, for sure, is equal to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered in the biosphere, which is not so sure. The consequence is that while we have got a price on carbon that is now influencing energy generators about choices for investment that they make, we also have embedded in an emissions trading scheme a reward for plant and pollute that the Climate Change Commission has identified as inconsistent with the long-term sustainability of net zero by 2050 and beyond. Because remember, the target is not just net zero in 2050, it's you get there and you stay there. And if the only way we get there is by planting trees and the only way we stay there is by planting even more trees, then we are not meeting our target. So one of the questions is carbon farming going to break the ETS? And the answer to that is, if left alone, the planting of Pinus radiata purely for carbon credits will indeed mean the ETS is unable to play the part it should in reducing gross emissions. We're not there yet. The government has some time in which to address this matter, and it should do so urgently, but in consultation with the most directly affected and impacted groups. Landowners, foresters, as well as those who need to acquire offsets. And finally, on offsets, increasingly the world is sceptical about biological offsets. We heard that earlier today, but the reality is the emissions are for certain for centuries to come, and the forest cover established is far from certain in decades to come.
How does the government, in conjunction with these stakeholders, need to advance this and urgently? How do we rebalance the incentives?
Well, first we have to recognise that there are property rights established in the scheme and that you need to maintain certainty and confidence that in fact there is a regime for pricing emissions that has a degree of predictability. But all participants should also understand that this is a regulated market and there is regulatory risk in this market. And therefore, any active participant in the market should be thinking about how is this market going to evolve, given the very clear signals that plant and pollute is not sustainable and not in the national interest as a way of solving our emissions problem.
Mayor Goff, how will local government shift from business as usual to properly addressing adaptation and planned retreat? And can you give us some specific examples?
Yeah, well, there's nothing more certain than we have to move from business as usual. Even with what we're doing, we are not remotely on track to meeting the goal of a 50% reduction by 2030. So business as usual simply isn't working. Why is it really important? 3,300 kilometres of coastline in Tamaki Makaurau, subject to sea level rises, which will probably put under threat over time $1.5 billion worth of our assets. We've got 90 legacy landfills the old days. They put the landfill on the coast and it all leached out, and that's going to be another, West Coast in the making. So there's an enormous amount of what we have to do. What have we done? First of all, the easy part was the Climate Emergency Declaration in 2019, and that went through with a unanimous support from councillors, which might be surprising given the conservative nature of some of them, but nobody minds a declaration. But how do you convert that declaration into practice? Well, the following year, 2020, and thanks to the professionals on our council staff, we had a climate action plan put in place. 2021, 150 million put towards that. And this year, election year 1, 2, we've got a situation where we lost $900 million in revenue through COVID, but we brought in a climate action targeted rate. And that was going to be the big political challenge for me personally, because nobody likes their rates going up, nobody votes for a rate increase, everybody wants things done, but nobody wants to pay for it. We all want to go to heaven, none of us want to die. But, but we actually got there, and 2 councillors, there were probably a lot more that wanted to oppose it, but 2 councillors voted against. But we'll raise $1.1 billion over the next 10 years through that climate action targeted rate and how we can leverage off central government. So anything but business as usual. I'll talk a little bit later probably about the Transport Emissions Reduction Program. It's hugely ambitious, it's hugely challenging, it's incredibly difficult, but we've got to do it. Because we've worked backwards. We've said, how do we meet what Paris asked of us? How do we meet what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is requiring of us? And you set your target, and then you've got to find a way of achieving that. But to find a way of achieving it, you've got to have a realistic plan, and then you've got to carry people with you. That's 2 things. And the third thing is you've got to have the political courage to do it. Because if we don't do this, I've used this phrase once or twice. I've got, grandkids that are almost born, 1, 2, 3 years old, the other 6 years old. What am I going to tell them, if I'm still around in 20 years' time, about the world that they're inheriting? And we've got to say, when we had the information, when we knew what we had to do, we had the guts to do it. And that's what we have to do, which is why business as usual simply won't cut it.
Stay with the plan then, and just elaborate. We'll come back to adaptation in a moment. You're speaking to a business audience here. We also have central government represented here. Tell me more about that working backwards, where council's got to, what is due to be implemented, bearing in mind we've got an election coming, but a bit more detail on how it's going to work and how it's going to affect these people.
Well, first of all, it's got to be by partnership, because council can't do it on its own, central government can't do it on its own, and nor can business or individuals. If you don't get all of those groups working together, and if you don't pull every lever that we have available to pull to get our emissions down, we won't achieve it. This is not incremental change, this is transformational change. This is the biggest change probably in our lifetime, and we have to do it. The evidence is there. James, you're still in the audience. First of all, thank you for what you've done. And then the second one, always, this is what you've got to do now. Central government takes, 93% of all public revenue in the country. So we're relying on that partnership to help fund. It has to happen. And I'm confident under your leadership, James, that it will. So that's really important. But we've also got to work through, as I mentioned before, carrying people with us. Because in politics, when your advisors, you've all seen Yes Minister, when your ministerial advisor says, very courageous minister, what he really means is you're a bloody fool and you've committed electoral suicide. So we do have to carry people with us, which means we've got to build our partnerships with the community and with the media. And, hopefully media here, but for God's sake, every time we do something on parking, it's a front page headline, council destroys parking opportunities. Nobody thinks about why don't we need to have these lanes so buses can move faster than cars? And if that means taking away parking, it means taking away parking. But we've got to have a media that's working with us. Simon Wilson's an honourable exception to that, and Catherine, you might be too. I better say that, hadn't I? As you're the moderator.
I try to have a bob each way.
So, but what we're trying to do, and with our shoreline adaptation programs at the moment is, we've divided the city into 20 different areas, and we're going through community by community, working with communities, working with mana whenua, saying, these are the options, this is what we've got to do. And, you know, the public in principle are with us. They've been supportive of the climate action change. We polled on that, and we went out and we got submissions, and, you know, 2/3 of the submissions were in favour. But the real crunch point comes when, hey, I've got to change my lifestyle, how I go about doing things if we're going to achieve what we're setting out to do. It's not council's responsibility or government's responsibility, it's the responsibility of everyone. And if we have the responsibility to explain to people why this has to happen, but people are going to have to take responsibility too and say, yes, we are willing to go back to the future. You know, the future where we used to ride our bikes to school. You know, if you're old as me, you'll remember that. Because nobody got dropped off at school when I was a kid. What a wuss you'd be if you got dropped off at school by your parents. When I was a toddler, this ages me, more people travelled by public transport here in Auckland, because we had trams, than travel by public transport today, despite our population having increased fourfold since then. So radical in one sense, because we've reversed the Los Angeles model that we were following, but not radical in the sense we've done this before and we need to do it again.
Okay, so a lot of this rests on more walking and cycling, especially that under 5K thing. It's a shocking statistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it gets as low as 2K, about 1/3 of our car trips. And not possible for everybody, for a lot of people adapting that. And also the public transport plan. I'll come back about the government funding to you in a moment. Vicky Robertson, the Minister, when he talked about a horizontal something over a whole bunch of vertical silos, my heart went out to you. Look, it is an issue that central government agencies are infamous for operating in silos. How is the public sector working to overcome this, to try and implement the emissions reduction plan, and also to do things at pace?
Yeah, I was just reflecting actually a couple of years ago, the conversation this kind of conference had, and it's quite different from today. So just reflecting that, we're coming to this, it's nice to come with some plans for a start, and I know they are the start of plans around emissions reduction plan and an adaptation plan, and they have been the result of 22 government agencies pulling together to deliver those, and those are plans for all of us, right? So that's quite different. What the Minister talked about was under the Public Service Act, there is an ability now to set up a board for cross-agency work, and it has the status of a proper board. So, you know, if you're on the board, you're a director and you can, you know, be recognised as such for IOD and all that sort of thing. Why that's important is that the public service does operate in silos. We have a vertical accountability mechanism, and this actually cuts through that, and that group of agencies is now accountable, in this case, to the Prime Minister for climate action and delivering on the emissions reduction plan, and the adaptation plan has come into that too. So I see some of my colleagues who are on that board here, Carolee McLeish from Treasury is on that board, as is MB, DOC, Transport and MPI. So why that's important is we often in the public service work to a minister, and this means that we have to work across the agencies, not just to deliver on those plans, but to give advice. You know, one plan is not going to be set and forget. The things are going to change. How do we adapt? How do we have an adaptive management approach? This is quite a different way of working. It's not a one-off climate crisis. It's an ongoing adaptive management. So how do we know what technology is coming on stream that we could take better advantage of? What advice can this board give to the government that they might want to take further steps towards, rather than just, you know, wait till 2025 to do our next plan? So I think that's in a really different kind of way of working. We're at the early days of that, and we are starting to provide advice on things like the climate emergency response budget as well. So how does the government invest in this as an overall, and how does that fit with the plan? So.
There's been several
Starting.
several references to Yes Minister. I'm going to pull out another old cliche, which is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And
Totally.
with respect to these folk, where are we at? We've talked about how each sector, government, business and citizenry, consumer, we have to work together and we have to work together faster. What is it that you can offer these people in business to, I think you were referencing almost a real-time updating of the plan. Can we envisage a situation that real-time updates the communications between government and business?
Yeah, I think the board offers the opportunity to work differently, both with the private sector, civic society, with Māori and other parts of the community. So through the development of the plan, the Emissions Direction Plan, we had conversations about what was getting in the way for business, for example, as we go forward. And how do we do this in a way that doesn't, mean that we've got lots of, you're talking to lots of different people. But if you think the question is the plan sufficient? And how do we make it go faster, then we should be engaging with our Māori partners, with business, to say, well, what are you doing? What is going to make that either go faster for you, or what's getting in the way, or what is coming on stream that we haven't even thought of yet, that you're seeing? Because business and civic society is always 10 million times faster than government. We need you to be ahead of the curve so that government can then pick that up and run with it. That's why collaborations like the Aotearoa Circle is incredibly important. The SPC and the climate leaders is really important so that you actually generate the new stuff. Like, for example, when we were in Australia, I was astounded about how fast they're moving into nature-based financial disclosures. Going really fast. They're going way faster than we are in New Zealand. How do we up the pace on that? We don't have capacity in the central government to do that in the next 6 to 12 months. What can we do as a sector with you all to really up the pace on that and not get left behind? And I think that's where our uniqueness needs to come in. We have a really important conversation there about what's our Indigenous view about having assets and nature as an asset on your balance sheet. What is it we could actually bring to that conversation that's different here for New Zealand?
Thank you, Vicky. Dr. Carr, we've talked a bit about land-based stuff. I just want to follow up with a bit more, and it's been alluded to a couple of times. Do you think here Waka Eke Noa will achieve what it was intended to? And what are the consequences if it doesn't? And the backstop, which is a big tool, is activated. Just explain what's riding on this.
I think the government and Parliament, actually, it wasn't just the government, the decision was made that we would put a price on agricultural emissions, that the farming community prefers a price to a tax or just outright regulation. The farming community wants to face a price that incentivises and rewards lower emitting land uses and lower emitting farming practices. That the backstop and essentially the already legislated options are ways in which you put a price on agricultural emissions, but in the view of the Climate Change Commission, don't actually give the right incentives for each 23,000 farming entity businesses to respond by moving towards lower land use and lower emitting farming practices. He Waka Eke Noa was a proposal for a pricing system given that agricultural emissions would be priced. The role of the Commission wasn't actually to review He Waka Eke Noa's proposal in all its granularity. It was to say, in your view, Commission, is the agricultural sector prepared for emissions pricing on the 1st of January 2025? The conclusion the Commission reached is, if you're going to put 23,000 farms into the emissions trading scheme as points of obligation, no, the farms are not ready and the system is not ready to take them. If you're going to put it in at essentially the processor level, the dairy factory or the meat works, then it's practical to do that by the 1st of January 2025, but it's not going to have the effect that you want, which is to reward movements towards lowering emissions in agriculture. So if you're going to have a farm level pricing system and you're going to have it in place by the 1st of January 2025, He Waka Eke Noa has elements of a proposal that could be workable by then. But there are some elements which in the Commission's view added unnecessary complexity and would undermine the objective, which is to reward lower emitting land use and farm practices. So, did the collective known as He Waka Eke Noa, that's 11 industry bodies and a couple of departmental observers, did they deliver a framework for pricing agricultural emissions at the farm level? Yes, in the view of the Commission, though, it's not going to be able to be up and running with that level of complexity by the 1st of January 2025. So we provided some advice about how you would be more likely to, no guarantees, get it up and running by the 1st of January. The government now has to decide what it's going to do. What it's not likely to do is back away from giving farmers what they wanted, which is a farm level pricing system.
Also, there's an impact were it to come into the ETS where the split gas that's been devised between CO2 and methane would be impacted, right? They would lose that discrimination.
Correct. It's an all gases CO2 equivalent GWP 100 system.
So as we're sitting here now trying to understand what's going to happen on 1 January 2025, what's your understanding?
Well, government will have to consult long before then and tell us by the end of this year what its plan is.
Okay. Mayor Goff, you talked about government funding. We know our councils are up against it with debt limits, any number of demands on infrastructure, rates rises, all the rest. Could you cut right to the chase on the reality of the funding that is going to be responsible, that is going to be necessary for councils to navigate their climate responses?
Yeah. Well, look, the burden will land on central government, and James is aware of that because that's the only place in the country we have got the resources to do it. Which is not to say that exempts us playing a part. We will have to play a part in local government. Business will have to make those changes, and individually you'll have to make those changes as well. So, what we're talking about, let's get it to the point of how you reduce emissions. We've got the highest level of emissions of any part of New Zealand coming from transport. Over 40% of our emissions come from transport. And we've figured out if we're to meet what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to meet, we've got to cut emissions, transport emissions, by 64% in what is now 8 years. 64% in 8 years. When I said it was challenging, it was difficult, it was ambitious, it's all of those things, but it's not impossible. And we've got to make it possible. And that means we've got to do a range of different things. One is about mode change. And to get mode change, I'm putting a big reliance on public transport. We have figured out we have to increase public transport patronage 5-fold over that period of time. So 2019, we were doing 103 million passenger trips a year. COVID has whacked that right back to 60, but we've got to get it up over 400 and around 500. And that means that we have to have the services available. Now, the Climate Action Targeted Rate will bring better public bus services within a range of 1 million Aucklanders by the measures that we bring. 10 new frequent travel networks that, you've got to have frequent travel networks because people want to turn up, they don't want to look at a timetable, they want to know that there's a bus coming in 5 or 10 minutes. We've got to have that, got to pay our drivers more, and we are getting some assistance from government on that, because if you don't have the bus drivers, you can't massively increase your fleet. We've got to complete our city rail link. Now, we're paying for half of that with government. Normally a rail link would be funded fully by government, but that will double our capacity overnight to carry people on heavy rail. That'll be really important. The main light rail running down the isthmus through Sandringham, through Mount Roskill, through Onehunga and Mangere, and then to the airport, that'll make a huge difference. Not only because it will provide rapid public transit, but because we reckon that we can put 25% of the growth of Auckland along that corridor. And, not only do we have to get mode change, but we've got to have a change in the form of the city. We're built as a sprawling suburb that was, massive number of suburbs that would be connected by motorways. The future is different. More of us are going to be living in apartments and in terrace housing. In fact, 80% of our building consents at the moment are for that intensive housing. So, our mind shift is already happening, and that's good. But there's an enormous amount of resource that has to go into that, into cycleways and walkways. How
much? What's the sum? Come on.
If I put a figure forward, that James will take that as the maximum figure,
We'll double
and not the minimum.
Yeah.
No, but we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Light rail by itself will be $15 billion. So that
many,
sort of financial support is
many tens
needed.
of billions of dollars, right? Many tens of billions of dollars.
Many tens of billions of dollars to save our future generations from climate disaster.
Well, let's talk about finances then, and if I could come back to you, please, Vicky Robertson. I've alluded to it a couple of times before, but I think it's important to understand the commitments we have made with respect to NDCs, and we're kind of out on our own on this. What is our exposure if we miss our 2030 targets and we have to pay up? I mentioned that earlier figure of $70, which is maybe a conservative carbon price around 2030. We're well into the billions heading for double figures, and that's not including an economic multiplier. Do we need to understand this better? And do we need to explain this better?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to understand it better, and I think that's why we're working with Treasury to look at what the financial, fiscal impact of that will be. We've done modelling and all that sort of thing to get to a figure. I mean, I think that the main thing, though, is we need to not use it as avoidance of the real work. The real work is to get on and start reducing the emissions now. And we keep talking about our NDC target and what is it going to cost. I think that's all important, but we also need to actually do the action.
It's an incentive to do the action, isn't it?
It is an incentive, and that's right. I mean, even for our public sector colleagues, having that 2025 deadline for us, where we are looking at, essentially a fiscal cost, it does absolutely focus the mind. But we are doing that work, but it doesn't change the action, right? You need to have people do the action. I mean, just in last week, we had a group of primary sector leaders with Te Hono who are probably the more enlightened people together, and one of the comments out of that was that, they're hopeful but they're scared. It was like, pennies are dropping because they went to see the Tasman Glacier. I mean, that's not a financial cost, but they saw it and can see the actual rate of what's happening with that glacier. So I think, all of these things need to be put in front of people. The financial cost is one of those. But I think the real question is, how do you stop discounting the future in your current decisions? So if there's a fiscal cost in the future, which is not just financial, how do we bring that forward to our decision making? So that when Phil Goff makes his decisions today, he's not doing the least amount because that's all we can afford today, because of whatever that cost is today. Not taking into account the fact that people in the future aren't going to have the ability to move around the city at all because of the impacts of climate change.
It's been a message this morning. We heard it earlier from a speaker to the effect of, is your business planning now based on the next 10% cut in your emissions, or whatever the percentage is for you, or maybe you've done really well but you're going to hit a plateau soon? Or is it built on an entirely different environment that is fossil fuel free, possibly radical consumer change? You're all up for your Kodak moment, potentially. And possibly radical investor change. God knows the insurers are out of the box and running. So is your planning looking into that as a reality and not just adjusting the status quo? I don't know. I'd like Dr. Carr's comment on what he is seeing and hearing within some of these business groupings. We've got, 30%, 40%, I think one's got 60% of New Zealand's GDP in its membership. Could you comment?
So a couple of things, Catherine. First of all, one of the hats that I have been wearing is on a United Nations committee that's been giving advice to Secretary General on, let's just call it greenwashing, net zero claims by non-state actors, so everybody but sovereign nations. And over the last 6 months, that work has progressed to the point where we've got final draft advice going forward. You heard it this morning. The reality is the world is increasingly sceptical about offsets. That net zero achieved with large chunks of offsets is not likely to be acceptable on the global stage. The consequence of your business is only looking at a small reduction in gross emissions and then paying somebody else to do something, you may find yourself outcompeted by other businesses that have taken more seriously on a genuine gross emissions reduction pathway through changes in business practice, working with your supply chain, adopting new technologies, or changing the products and services that you create. Those are the biggest threats to a business. It's not some regulator coming along and putting a price on emissions. It's the bank's not willing to lend you the money, the investor's not willing to provide the equity, the customer's not willing to buy your products, because basically your competitors got the equity, got the funding, and got your customers. That's what will put you out of business. And that's the emerging world that, yes, New Zealand needs to reduce its emissions because that's our contribution to making the world a safer place for all. But the reality is it's now in New Zealand's self-interest, because high-emitting lifestyles are going to become relatively more expensive, and high-emitting livelihoods are going to become relatively more vulnerable. And if you want to live in a vulnerable and expensive country, then live with high emissions.
Can I bring you back in, Mayor Goff? We were talking about adaptation earlier. Could you give us a reality check on what yours and other councils are facing, and how you're going to handle that with matters like managed retreat or non-managed retreat? Give us some reality check on what is in the not too distant future, and certainly in the medium term future.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier what the potential costs are, and they're huge. And we're starting now under the Climate Action Plan with going area by area of our coastline and saying, this is the risk of erosion, this is the risk of sea level rise, this is the risk of flooding. 20% of our buildings in Auckland, 150,000, are at risk of flooding. And there are a number of things that we've got to do. One, and I'm lobbying James again, he gets this all the time, I know what it was like, James, but we had Jack Hodder QC say, the big risk to council at the moment is that when you stop development because of projected climate change, you'll be litigated against in court and it'll cost you billions. We have to have absolute certainty that empowers us to stop development where we believe that future development, it might be in 10 or it might be in 20 or it might be in 30 years, is at risk. So that's one of the things that we need. Secondly, I'm not in favour of an insurance scheme. I don't believe the state should take over insuring what the private sector regards as uninsurable, because they regard it as uninsurable for a purpose, for a reason. But I do believe that people who have bought properties, who have bought land, who have bought buildings, built buildings, without knowing of the future risk, there's got to be some form of compensation. Otherwise, we're going to have tens of thousands of people in Tamaki Makaurau that will lose everything that they've invested their life savings in. And we don't have the ability to do that at local level. And I'm not sure even that the government has the ability at the moment. But surely we've got to think about something like the Earthquake Commission, where everybody pays a levy, and when somebody loses their property because of an earthquake which nobody has predicted and nobody can be held account for, we can stop people falling into poverty because they've lost their assets. So I think the next big thing we've got to see from government is a plan for how we can provide that compensation without sending the wrong message that if you build in the wrong place and you don't care about the consequences, somebody's going to bail you out. So it's that balance. And we're working currently in partnership with our communities in Mana Whenua to say, what is managed retreat? We're not using that word. I think managed realignment, retreat kind of has unfortunate connotations. But we've got to work out, because we won't be able to put the seawalls up everywhere, and we won't be able to do, the beach nourishment everywhere to stop it happening. And we've got to work out where we pull back, where we relocate our assets. And that's what these shore adaptation plans are about. What we can preserve, what we need to have realignment on, and effectively where we act and where we do nothing.
And many of those assets, of course, aren't just people's houses. They are major infrastructure. They're airports, and they'll be your assets as well, no doubt.
Exactly. They belong to all of us.
Yeah. Look, thanks very much. Could go on for hours, but thank you very much for the time you've given today. Mayor Phil Goff, thanks Rod Carr, thanks Vicky Robertson, thank you very much.